you leave tonight. So without further ado, let's welcome Peter McMahon.
Okay, how's my sound? Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to the Historical Society for having me and for all you folks for turning out. It's the more people than I've seen in the last 3 days. I went to Stop and Shop, it was 6 cars, so this is where everybody is. So I'm going to talk a little about, the modern architecture on the Outer Cape, how it got here, some of the people behind it, and also our efforts to preserve and to kind of reuse or recycle some of these. So I always like to start at the end of the last ice age. Of course, a lot of you know the geology of the Cape. The last of the great glaciers kind of came down like a snowplow, pushing all this sand and soil and boulders, and then it retreated. The topsoil and the boulders all went to the islands and the lower Cape. The Outer Cape just got sand, and that's had a huge effect on the economy of the Outer Cape and people's livelihoods. We've always been kind of hunter-gatherers. So, of course, the Wampanoag-speaking people were here, nobody knows for sure, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 years before the Europeans. And their buildings, the Weetus, which there's a lot of them around, they're still being built. And actually, apparently, Wampanoag families were still building these and using them up into the 1960s. Sort of in the woods behind a house, often there'd be a Weetu that would be used in the summer. There's a number of them in Mashpee at the Wampanoag Museum, and there's a longhouse. There's 2 longhouses at the Wampanoag Tribal Council area which is where they do all their tribal decision making. So the Weetu has some features that I think carry through to the modern architecture, and actually some themes that reappear over and over again. One is the very light frame, of course made of readily available material. This light frame that has a sort of skin hung on it, in some cases actual skins, but usually actually tree bark or mats made of reeds. There's an inside layer, an outside layer, and then there are benches around the inside. And very often the Wampanoags would live down by the water in the summer and back in the woods in the winter for protection. And they would leave the frame, so they would take the skin and reuse it. Also, the buildings were expandable, so you could make multifamily ones. So there's this kind of idea of a modular, expandable building with demountable elements. Apparently when the settlers got here, they said these were very comfortable and easy to heat in the winter and were more comfortable than the settlers' homes. So they were functional and then, of course, shortly after the Europeans got here, they cut down all the trees, and if you look at pictures of even from the 50s of Wellfleet and Truro, there are no trees. And so ships became a very important source of wood, shipwrecks. So Thoreau writes about watching somebody take the mast of a ship and with a hatchet make it into hundreds of shingles. So they were constantly reusing this. Wood was super valuable at the time. And there are all these maritime laws, some of you probably know about this, about who owned the ship, that it belonged to the town, so the townspeople could go out and dismantle the ship and reuse all the parts. Many boat parts in so many buildings around here. Another aspect of the Cape is sort of vernacular buildings being repurposed into for cultural purposes. So this is a fish pier in Provincetown. It was the home of the Provincetown Players and Eugene O'Neill, so this was the place where Eugene O'Neill's first play was performed, and in this fish pier, with people sitting on planks that were on barrels and the water sloshing up between the floorboards. So very simple utilitarian buildings that are often kind of occupied by high culture. This later burned down. Also, the moving of buildings. This is a house being moved from Long Point in Provincetown into the town. Buildings were floated, buildings were dismantled and put on sleds. They were, or flaked as they call it, taken apart and numbered, all parts numbered and then reassembled. So Wellfleet used to be 3 small towns. One of them was Boundbrook Island. And when the harbor silted up there and we moved to where it is now, these, almost all the buildings on Boundbrook Island were moved into town. So this is an oyster shack in Wellfleet Harbor. They're gone now, but there is one that is been moved up to the parking lot at Mayo Beach. But when the early modernists got here, they would have seen these oyster shacks in the 40s and 50s. This is where people would unload, their fishermen would unload. And there's this idea of this sort of simple wooden box up on wooden piers, which is another thing that reappears. So Wellfleet during the Depression was very depopulated. We got down to about 350 people. So a lot of empty buildings, a lot of empty land, and a lot of this kind of rolling hills with very few trees. So this is, if you know Wellfleet, this is Horseleech Pond, and that's the Atlantic on the right. This is part of 800 acres that a man named Dr. Bromland, who was a dentist and an inventor, and one of the pioneers of X-ray technology. He was kind of like Ben Franklin type who hybridized his own kinds of meat. Anyway, he bought, over the course of years, he acquired 800 acres and started living on this land, and kind of he spent all his time out with the transit trying to figure out where the boundaries of the land were. But when he got to be, in his older life, he gave all this land to Jack Phillips on the left here. So Jack Phillips went to Harvard undergrad. He was from a fancy family. His great uncle was the first mayor of Boston. And Phillips, Exeter, and all those schools were named after his family. So he was kind of the black sheep, though, although his family gets very mad when I use that term. But he was an artist. He went to Paris. And he was given this 800 acres, and he started kind of homesteading there and putting up buildings that were kind of his naive version of what he'd seen in Europe as modern architecture. By the way, there's a whole raft of books. Show you. I'll kind of go by the members of this group, the children and grandchildren. The Upper Bohemia is written by Jack Phillips' daughter. It's about life. A lot of it takes place around Horseleech Pond. The Paper Palace is like being turned into an HBO series, but that's a granddaughter of Jack Phillips. That's kind of trashy. The Shores of Bohemia is a very comprehensive book about sort of 1900 to 1960 of the kind of leftists and the artists and the writers that were in Provincetown, Truro, or Wellfleet, and by John Taylor Williams, who is he's a book literary agent, and his stepfather was Jack Hall, who we'll meet in a little while. And then To the Life of the Silver Harbor is by Rule Wilson, who's the son of Mary McCarthy and Edmund Wilson, the famous New Yorker writer and critic. And together they're pretty fascinating portrait of Wellfleet kind of in that time. And anyway, there's an article in the Times 3 weeks ago, and inspired by all of these books coming out, sort of like a mini tsunami of books about this period. So Jack Phillips starts building these kind of naive modernist buildings. A lot of them were painting studios because a lot of these people were artists. This is a little sort of studio he built with north-facing glass at the end of Black Pond Road, right near Horseleach. And this is a painting of it by Javier Gonzalez, the Spanish painter who used it as a studio. This building later fell into the ocean. So a lot of these buildings, although we call them the Brahmin Bohemians, Jack Phillips, Jack Hall, and Hayden Walling, they were from old upper-class families. They were kind of the hippies of those families, and they were always broke, partly because they got married so many times and had so many children that they were... but actually, I think they were married 14 times between the three of them. So anyway, a lot of these buildings were made with very simple material, recycled material, and sometimes actual driftwood, or chunks of stuff that will wash up the beach. And then, of course, it becomes driftwood again. So it's like a full circle there. Phillips buys a trainload of these army barracks right after the war. These were prefab army barracks, and he just put them up wherever he thought would be a good spot for a house on this 800 acres. This is 2 of those barracks put together, and this this house is still standing, and it's the house of Arthur Schlesinger, who is in Kennedy's cabinet, and his family still lives there. So there's this kind of Thoreauvian idea of this living in a shack in the woods in a very beautiful spot, and you never need to improve it or do anything. If you know anything about postmodern architecture, this is Charles Jenks, who kind of coined that term, architect and landscape architect. He kind of grew up partly in Wellfleet, and here he is in front of the barracks. So a lot of abandoned farmhouses in Wellfleet, and this was the home where Lorenzo Dow Baker was born. He became the banana king, became a millionaire from figuring out how to ship bananas, green bananas, to the U.S. Then it was owned by John Dos Passos for a brief time, although he never really moved in. And then it was bought by Jack Hall. This is around in the late 30s. He also bought a number of barns, post and beam barns around, and assembled them and made actually a working farm. He had a Rolls Royce. He actually had 2. He had one for parts. And he used to drive this into Provincetown to go to dinner with people hanging out. Jack Hall, also a self-taught, untrained architect who's also a self-taught artist and farmer. And he lived in a series of these old farmhouses. So he really liked the old vernacular buildings, but he also really liked modernism, and he would just mash them together. So he'd often have a giant plate glass window in this glass corner in this house that's from 1730 or so. So he didn't see any contradiction there. He just liked old things and he liked new things, and he just combined it. And this is a kind of a vernacular peculiar to Wellfleet to some degree, where you have this mashup of old and new. I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a Saarinen womb chair back there, and then these old shaker things, and all just together. So Jack Hall's great accomplishment is the Hatch House, which some of you might have made it to the open house we had in the spring. So the Hatch House, as I say, he was not trained, but he did work for the great industrial designer George Nelson for a few years in New York, and he learned how to draft, and he learned a lot about building, and then he came back and got this commission to build a house for the Hatch family. Robert Hatch was the editor of The Nation magazine. His wife Ruth was a painter, And they had stayed actually in Edwin Dickinson's a sort of chicken houses or a barn, place that all had chicken coops in it. And that had something to do with this design. But again, you have this is a house under construction. It's this very rigorous, theoretical, modernist structure that involves this grid. It's a sort of superstructure. And then these panels set in. And I would make the connection here with the V-tube in that there's this very light frame with these sort of skin on it. In this case, the panels are in floor, ceiling, and wall panels can be put in different ways to make different configurations. And the idea was that it's almost like a kinetic structure, actually partly based on this work by, this is a model of something called the Jungle Gym that was, that George Nelson designed for this USAID project in Moscow, which was the first big, this is where Nixon and Khrushchev had the kitchen argument about whose kitchens were better. But this was for displaying US-made products and appliances and so forth. So this was a big kind of scaffold structure. And you can see that, there's a model. You can see that, this is another building, another project, unbuilt project by George Nelson. That was a factory-made aluminum cubes connected by walkways that had these sort of jacks for making different heights. So he would have seen this in the office also, I think, as a reference for the Hatch House. The Hatch House, you can see it's, there's no wall per se, it's really just siding. So there's no wall cavity, there's no wall, there's no insulation. It's really like a very high concept dune shack. But the superstructure provides the stability, and then there's just this very thin skin of siding, and that's it. So also the Hatch House opens and closes with these shutters, so that the first time I saw it, it looked kind of like this, and I couldn't tell what it was. I thought maybe it was a place for storing lobster pots or something. It really wasn't obvious that it was a house. It was so severe in a way. And so basically I started the trust in 2000. I filed for to create the trust in 2017 in order to try, in 2007, to try to lease these buildings from the Park Service. So the Park Service owned a number of important modern structures. They were not aware that they were important, and in fact, when I got on the scene, they were just starting to figure out that some of them might be of historical interest. These houses were all reclaimed by the park because they were built in the 2-year period between 59 and 61. So briefly, the Kennedys introduced legislation to create the Cape Cod National Seashore in 59, and a lot of people were fighting it. Developers, people that had big pieces of land, and so they fought about it for 2 years, and it passed in 61. And if you started building in that 2-year period, you were gambling basically, and those people lost, the people that started. And the Hatch family was one of those families. So they usually got 25 years and had to vacate, and these buildings were all supposed to be demolished. So the Hatch family stopped taking care of the building. They thought they were going to lose it. And luckily, Ruth Hatch was still alive. And when I started the project, and we made plans for her to put everything in the house into storage. And then when we finished the restoration, they put everything back. This is the crew there for the foundations. We had to dig up every footing and replace it. So most of the building you see is all original, but all the infrastructure is new in the foundation. That's one of the walkways outside, and that's you can see Provincetown, off there to the north. It's the interior, so we have all the furniture, the art, the books, the kitchen equipment, everything is original. This is the only house we restored out of 4 where we got the content. So the contents are are great for giving context. So these folks were very good friends with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and I have pictures of them all hanging around there, having martinis and talking about leftist politics. This is the plan of the hatch house. So there's these 7 by 7 foot modules. He designed this as a prefab modular building that could be arranged in different ways, into a square donut or a L shape. This is the configuration that was built in this case, and they did add 1 cube onto the right, which made that into a big bedroom, and they followed all the same rules. So the family, it wasn't the original architect, but that's a rendering from my book, Cape Cod Modern, with the shutters open. Very Japanese. All of these people were these architects were very influenced by traditional Japanese architecture and also New England vernacular. The Hayden Walling was the 3rd one of these, Brahmin Bohemians. His parents were famous American socialists who were 2 of the founders of the NAACP, International Ladies Garment Union. He came to Wellfleet when he was 18 and bought land from Jack Phillips and started building his own house. A lot with parts of old buildings, including an old water tower that was downtown that he dragged back there with a wagon. And he actually used a lot of the bricks and old locust beams that were still there from when that was one of the small towns. That was called the 3rd settlement. So really using old material from the 1700s. A lot of these buildings look kind of more traditional on the outside and more modern on the inside. Hayden Walling became a very good builder, an architect, totally untrained. He never learned to draw. He really just did it all kind of by the seat of his pants. This is the Lachey house for the painter James Lachey. A lot of reused boards there you can see. And this is the James Lachey's painting studio. These were very inexpensive buildings, $4,000 or $5,000 total budget. Sometimes plywood is the siding. In some cases it was actually homosote, which is pressed paper, which would usually be replaced with side plywood or sometimes shingled. This is another house by Hayden Walling. This is actually on the cover of my book, but this is from the inside. So in order to get a big wall of glass, they couldn't get big plate glass, so they could get strips of glass, and they would sort of lap them kind of like clapboards. So originally, the glass has been replaced here, but they had to really build with what was available at Nickerson or Mid-Cape Lumber. They didn't. It was a long drive, off Cape back in those days before the highway to get anything. So same time period in Germany, we have the Bauhaus, which was a combination of a school of art and a school of craft. Really came out of the American arts and crafts movement and European versions of that, and the Werkbund and all of these sort of kinds of early modernism that had a lot to do with handcraft. So it was founded by Walter Gropius, here seen in his mother's Victorian parlor. So important to realize that the early modern architects were all Victorian, raised in the Victorian era, and had Victorian classical education. So he went to architecture school, but he studied Greek, Roman, classicism. So this was a very radical departure. So Gropius designed this. This is the second Bauhaus in Dessau. The first one was in Weimar, and the last one was in Berlin. There were 3 versions. They kept getting evicted from different cities in the build-up to World War II. So this is Gropius's design. It looks like a factory. It's really a factory for design and art. So this is a very early version of a glass curtain wall. where the glass is completely separate from the structure, so that there's so you can have this complete wall of glass and steel. So modernism, in the time, modernism was it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the new materials that were available. So reinforced concrete, plate glass, structural steel, and all of the structural and kind of possibilities of those materials. And modernism was in part kind of a way to digest that, the Industrial Revolution, and to aestheticize it, and to kind of humanize it and express it. So Gropius starts this school, and it goes from 1919 to 1933, so a very short period of time when the last version was closed in Berlin, but it was not a very big school, actually, quite a small school, incredibly influential still to this day as this kind of crucible of all of these new ideas. And he got all of them sort of most avant-garde thinkers, artists, painters of Europe and gathered them. And one of those was Marcel Breuer, so he came to the Bauhaus at 18 from provincial Hungary. He became the master of the furniture shop and really invented tubular steel furniture inspired by bicycle handlebars. So this was a very radical chair for the time. If you think of upholstered Victorian furniture, this was this very, very high tech.
What year?
23, I believe. So this is the Vasily chair he designed for Vasily Kandinsky, who was a painter who taught at the Bauhaus. This is the Cheska chair he designed, which is one of the most commonly knocked off pieces of furniture in the world. We literally have seen these in gas stations, in the most remote places, or just they're everywhere. So this chair design is they say, oh, modernism is very elitist and no one can afford it, but this furniture in some knockoff form is one of the most common chairs in the world. And it's extremely functional and very light, and it embodies Breuer's idea of constructivism, which is that you always see everything, nothing is hidden. You see every connection. And then there's this dichotomy between the factory-made structure, which is a manufactured thing, and then this man-made human touch material, which is leather. So it's a natural material and it's hand-wrought, and you can see that. And then the Breuer always had this dichotomy. He called it sun and shadow, where you want to unite the opposites.
How are these manufactured? Did you actually have someone hitting the steel with a hammer? Or, nowadays they have modern CNC machines, which, automatically can make the whole thing in one machine.
Oh, it's all just welded. So they have pipe bending. You have pipe bending, benders, and then you weld it.
Yeah.
And then you polish it, and then you chrome it.
Is it all one pipe? Or
Yeah.
is it,
Well, it wasn't originally. Yeah. But it's like a bicycle handlebar, basically. So Gropius had a group around him at the Bauhaus that included Herbert Bayer, the graphic designer, Xanti Schawinski, Breuer, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And they used to vacation a lot and go skiing a lot in Europe. One thing is the Bauhaus get a lot of bad press, especially there's a big sort of backlash against modernism in the 70s and 80s. And there was a big critique of the Bauhaus, which is that they wouldn't let women do anything except weaving. And it turns out this is not at all true. It's just that the scholarship was not good about it. But actually, there's the woman, Elizabeth Otto, who's going to be our curator this fall. We're having about 4 Bauhaus scholars come and look at all of the Breuer material. But she's actually done all this primary research where she went back and looked at the registers of who was in what classes. And it turns out that women were all through the Bauhaus doing all kinds of stuff. This is the wood shop. And then especially photography. Now this has really just recently come to light. This work was not known until very recently. A lot of it was lost because of the war. When the Bauhaus was closed, a lot of people some people died in the Holocaust, people fled to other countries, and a lot of this work was lost. So this is Marianne Brandt, who actually did tons of this kind of distorted photography. This is Gertrude Arndt, who also was a photographer, who did a lot of these kind of self-portraits in costumes, which is very much like Cindy Sherman or people working in the 80s who never would have seen this because this work was never out there. It had already been done. When you Google Bauhaus, you always get the 80s punk band they really captured this. They were obviously went to art school and probably had a very, in a lecture saw the Bauhaus students. But, the early Bauhaus was very expressionist and kind of into the occult, and they were vegetarians and Zoroastrians, and then the Bauhaus became very rationalist. So but the early Bauhaus was sort of like actually all the expressionists left at one point, and it became very rationalist. And I think the band that best expresses that, of course, is Kraftwerk or Kraftwerk. These are the scholars we're having as our scholars in residence this year. This is Elizabeth Otto on the left, and 3 other Bauhaus scholars. And we're going to be looking at all of the material from the Breuer house. So at the Breuer's own house, we have the art, the books, the furniture, and everything, which has mostly been undocumented. So the Nazis closed the last version of the Bauhaus in 1933. Everybody scatters. Breuer and Gropius and that group had already gone to London for a while, and then they all came here in 1937 when Gropius got hired to take over the Harvard's architecture and design school. So he created the Graduate School of Design, which is landscape, interiors, architecture, etc. They spent the summer of 1937 in Wareham on Billiams Bay. In Marion. And they kind of regrouped. They had been sort of escaped different places, Switzerland, Portugal, some to Latin America, and they all kind of slowly got visas to come to the U.S. And Breuer and Gropius went to Harvard, took over the architecture department. Maholy-Nagy went to Chicago and started a new Bauhaus, and some of the others were in Black Mountain College in North Carolina. So this is Xanti Schawinski, Maholy-Nagy, and Herbert Bayer that summer. And this is them reenacting Neptune and his sons fighting a sea serpent. So the first of the Europeans, so they all kind of scattered. The first of the Europeans that made it to Wellfleet was Serge Chermayeff, Russian, educated in England, came to Wellfleet around 1943, bought a piece of land from Jack Phillips and with an old hunting shack on it, and took up residence and started building. There was no electricity, and there was a water pump out in the yard and an outhouse, so it was very primitive. And this is one of his early buildings. This is a studio. It's actually been expanded in both directions and had another part added onto it. But another one of these very light frame buildings with these panels hung onto it. And actually, he was always reconfiguring this, and you could demount those panels and actually demount the windows and rearrange them. So it's almost like a house of cards. There are 7 of these, and I believe they're all still intact, although they've been altered. So by 1945, this is Chermayeff in the middle, Bernard Radovsky on the left, and Gyorgy Kepes on the right. So Kepes started the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, which has kind of turned into the ACT, Art, Culture, Technology, and to some degree, very influential person whose thing was basically softening the boundaries between art and science. And Bernard Radowski was a very important architect and writer, and did many big shows at MoMA on vernacular architecture. So by the mid-40s, they were already had a kind of think tank around Chermayeff's house. They were spending a lot of time here, hanging out. They'd spend the whole summer here and grow beards and plan projects together. They would work all day, and then they'd come out at night and have parties and play ping pong and bonfires on the beach. So it was kind of like a very, it was work and play. They had these studios, and they were painting or writing or doing whatever they do during the day. Gropius here and Xanti Schawinski, also in the mid-40s. This is Xanti's assistant. They're making kites. And this is Aunt Mary's Pond on the lovely Truro line. There was an old ice house on this pond that was used by Breuer, it was used by Xanti Schawinski, it was used by all these famous people as a studio. And the park tore it down, unfortunately, but because it was, that history wasn't known. So Breuer comes up with this idea he calls the Longhouse, which became one of his two major house prototypes. So it's basically a long wooden box with, in this case, a suspended porch, and up on wooden piers. This is the basic plan on the left. So this is the A part. There's a B part that was a studio, and then often there was a C part that was an extension of the studio. So there's 4 of these in Wellfleet that are the same prototype. There's some of them are a mirror image of the other or flipped, but they are. Breuer didn't really believe in starting from scratch for something like this. He came up with a prototype, and then he would just alter it and reproduce it. This is the Wise House on Indian Neck in Wellfleet. This is a story that Life magazine did in 1950, showing the porch in Breuer's house. He also said that these houses were like a camera on a tripod, and he would just get to the right perfect spot for the view, and that's where the porch would be, because they spent all day on the porch. They ate all their meals there. And this house, you could see 3 ponds there before all the trees grew. So this is Williams, Higgins, and Gull Pond. Breuer's house was very experimental. The original version was very simple, kind of like just the chassis of a house. And then as he lived there, he added an oak floor, he added plywood ceilings, he made more elaborate furniture. In the beginning, really, there's just kind of a mattress on the floor and a picnic table, and that's it. And so there's this extreme minimalism. He made a lot of this furniture, but you can see the tables are just cement blocks. And then he designed these rugs. He and his wife, Connie, designed these rugs and had them made, and I actually have 2 of these rugs that the son has donated to the trust. We are hoping someday to get our hands on this house. It's not owned by the park, it's still owned by Breuer's son, and it's been very neglected, and it's a really important building, probably the most important of the modern houses. Unfortunately, he's asking a very large sum for it right now. But hopefully there will be a pathway at some point for a happy ending for this house where it will be restored and protected. This is Xanti Schawinski, his later years on the porch, and that's Connie Breuer on the right. On the left is this woman that we couldn't identify in the first edition of the book, and I found her. She was living in New York. She just passed away last year, but this is Christina Bevington. She worked in Breuer's office. She was French Senegalese, and I think one of the only women of color that was a registered architect in the early 60s. loft with her husband, who was a sculptor, right off of Broadway, above Union Square Park. This is Kepes and his wife Juliet in their house in Cambridge, which was published in Life magazine. They made this whole environment for their kids with these sort of trees they could climb up and all of these learning things, this clock that you could manipulate, and this beautiful mural that Juliet Kepes did. So we did a show at the Wellfleet Historical Society about 6 years ago of all the children's books produced by the modernists, this group of people, and it was over 200. So Gropius, his daughter, did 50. Julia Kepes won the Caldecott Award and she wrote and illustrated amazing books. So for some reason, children's books were really, I don't know, that really took off right at that moment. This is the exhibit with this is a replica of that mural that was done for a show at MoMA. So there is a Breuer house in Dennis, and the curator at MoMA asked, he came to the original show that we did in 2006, and he said, there's a Breuer house in Dennis, can you find it? And I asked everyone in Dennis. I searched, I could not find it. And then finally there was a data dump of Life photographs, and this picture came up, and I could tell it was the house because of the plan. It's like an equal sign with two parallel bars, and a reporter from Cape Cod Times got interested in it and did a search by the family name of the Barnstable records, which I should have done, and we found it, and it was completely minced with the original furniture, the original family. And this was a high-budget Breuer house with radiant heating and everything, and all this woodwork, and so anyway, that was, you could have knocked me down with a feather, because it was like Shangri-La, we put it in. Yeah.
I see at the foot of the bed there's wood slatting, which I see kind of similar stuff of in a lot of these other photos. Is that something they came up with, or is it something involved?
Yeah, that's a George Nelson bench.
Nice.
And actually, the porch of the Hatch House is very reminiscent.
Yeah, exactly. I see it in a few of the photos, and I'm wondering if they took inspiration.
Yeah, they still sell those. Designer that Reach sells them. It's a George Nelson bench. And then there's an Oliver Alto stool and chairs, Paul McCobb. And, so Breuer probably picked some of the original furniture. I think this is Florence and Knoll couches. But anyway, it's just kind of amazing to see it all there. And it was kind of in some disrepair, but nothing had ever been altered. Important Breuer house was demolished just recently, the Geller house on Long Island. It was bought and demolished by the family next door who built a tennis court there. So I have friends in England who are always dumbfounded about this because, their historic buildings are listed and you can't touch them. This country, very difficult, really, especially 20th century buildings, unless there's a conservation restriction or they're in a historic district. It's just really hard to protect them, which is why it's so important that the next generation of the original builders have some feeling for preserving the building, because once it goes out of the family, it's really tough. Another person that came because of Breuer is Paul Weidlinger, very important structural engineer. He really wrote the book on seismic engineering and blast proofing of structures. There's a whole Hungarian scene, Breuer, Kepes, Weidlinger, a few other families. And there's a great online paper called Offbeat Budapest, and this young guy who started it just came and did a whole story on the Hungarian connection, which you can read if you look Offbeat Budapest. So Weidlinger came to Wellfleet in early 50s, and he did the Beinecke Library at Yale, which is an unbelievable building. If you go to New Haven, just take a little side trip. It's the rare book library, and it's an incredible building. He also did his firm did the analysis of the collapse of the World Trade Center, and they were the engineers for all of the new proposals for the replacement of the World Trade Center. So they're kind of the experts. So this is the house built in '53, and this is the third house that we acquired and restored. It was empty for 20 years. It was in very bad shape. A tree had fallen on that corner and crunched the roof. It was open to the weather. It was kind of on the edge of being savable. There's a plan of it. And this is after the restoration. This is before and after. There's a Kepes painting there. So with these houses, we have to furnish them based on photographs, and we get a lot of donated furniture and art, and then we get a lot of things on loan. So that's a big Kepes painting on loan. And then I find a lot of it at the dump in Wellfleet. This has this enormous door, sliding glass door that's 8 by 16 feet, and it's triple glazed, and it was donated by a company in Austria, and we had to get it down this tiny dirt road in this terrible driveway and up onto this building. It was a difficult one. Also, people who are around in Wellfleet, the Saarinen family, Eero Saarinen, and Florence Knoll, who grew up with the Saarinens at Cranbrook in Michigan. And Florence Knoll kind of really invented what we think of as modern office furniture. She basically made agreements with all of the, she basically was responsible for mass producing all the architect designed mid-century furniture of that era. So, and sold it through Knoll Furniture. But also, she designed all what she called the in-between pieces, so the conference tables, the credenzas, which are beautiful. She just passed away, I believe. Also, so other people who were hanging around, Konrad Wachsmann, who's kind of the father of the space frame. It was one of his ink drawings, which is pre-computer. Oliver Alto came to Wellfleet while he was teaching at MIT. This is a drawing he did called Cape Cod Hurricane. Charlie Zender was a very prolific architect, actually never studied architecture, but went to RISD in sculpture and came to Wellfleet in the late 50s and built, we found 53 buildings that he did, including the house that I grew up in. My parents hired him when I was 10, and so this is partly how I got interested in this. He did a number of these poured concrete buildings, kind of towers. He was obsessed with these fortifications on the Channel Islands, and this is one of his drawings. He did beautiful drawings. This is the house I grew up in as a kid. That's not a good picture of it, but it was sort of 3 wedge shapes. It was an amazing house. And the first house that we restored was Zender's cool Gibbs house, which was also in a very advanced state of decay, but a beautiful building, not easy to take care of, but it's a beautiful building. It has these single glazed but cornered windows and these big cantilevers. He met Frank Lloyd Wright when he was young and drank the Kool-Aid and was very into that whole thing. This is what you see when you drive, when you come up. And that's a plan. Very eccentric plans, very sort of labyrinthine and eccentric. And he was doing his own thing. This is during the restoration. This is the original exhibit we did in 2006, which started this whole project at PAM in Provincetown, the Art Association. So this was a show I did with Bob Bailey and a Province Young Artist, where we started finding the research material, and I had a student from Northeastern build these beautiful wooden models of 7 of the buildings. So this started this whole thing where I started trying to find all the modern houses in the woods, some of them in advanced states of decay, and I started talking to the Park Service right at this time because I knew they owned some. So this started this whole research project where I started trying to find the children and grandchildren of the architects and the clients, and 10 years of that, and that basically became my book, Cape Cod Modern. And I had to actually cut a lot out. My editor kept saying, that's too much, no, that's no good, get them out. You know, like if it was just a side story that didn't connect to anything. So, but there's not going to be a second volume. So we do tours, house tours. This is the house by Olav Hammarstrom. This was the house of Admiral Nimitz. In
wow.
The 4-star admiral, and his son was a 1-star admiral, I think. So we also do an artist residency in the fall, and sometimes that's a conference. This is a conference we had at the Chermayeff house, so we used this big room at the Chermayeff house. It was on urban and rural issues. And last year we had all native artists, so we had native artists from 4 states, from 4 different tribes that came and stayed in the houses. This is Paula Peters, who's a Wampanoag tribal leader, who was the curator. She's in front of the Chermayeff house there with her dog. And some of the artists who participated. And this is an amazing photograph. This is done by one of the artists, Jeremy Dennis, who's a very young artist who's Shinnecock from Long Island, and he does these photographs that are about kind of the uneasiness that we have with the indigenous presence that's in the landscape. So this is me here, and that's him in this kind of Hollywood Indian drag. And then he's photographing himself with a drone, and then he photoshops all these versions of him. And the idea is that the white person can't really see the native people. So I've got like these binoculars, and I'm looking, and he's sort of surrounding. The work is really amazing because it's very it's very political, but it's also funny, and he uses these sort of zombie movie references. But you should look him up. His name is Jeremy Dennis, and the project, the series is called the Rise series. So the book is available from the website, and it's going into its 5th printing. It's going into its 5th printing. So we did one more. The 4th house that we did is the Kohlberg house, which was also empty for 20 years in a very exposed location. So this house was pretty much rotten all the way through by the time the park decided they wanted us to take it on. And really there's almost nothing of the original building left except part of the roof and the cinder block basement. But we have to restore it exactly the way it was because it's on the National Registry. And this is a very simple house by a guy named Luther Kroll, who was from a very old Cape family who he would sell you the land, design the house, and build it. So he owned a lot of South Wellfleet, and he built hundreds of houses. It's a very simple house, but it's very beautiful, and it's in this amazing location.
Is that in Wellfleet?
Yeah, it's right near Newcomb Hollow Beach. That's it.